Okay, so I'm recording this as well.
Sure.
Random question. So Parmenides, he's got the formulation of what is.
I'm not familiar. I don't
Okay.
know much about Parmenides.
Do you know the axioms, all the axioms in objectivism, are they like part of it is from Aristotle, right? Like A is
Yeah.
identity, existence apparently, according to Oakbay, is from Parmenides, what is.
Yes.
And then, so what was added in the objectivist axioms? Was it that it was all systematized into
I
one?
think so.
Yeah.
A systemization of those recognitions.
Okay. And there's this definition of ethics. Ethics is there to provide a code of values to guide human choices and actions. So when you define it that way, though, you're skimming on virtues. So is a virtue of value in a way? Like a virtue is something you obviously do, but is it a value in the sense that you want to do it? Is that still a value, or is it completely separate?
I think there is some ambiguity in that language. I don't think it's easy to say which it is. I usually think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really make a strong distinction other than to recognize that the point of any action is to attain or achieve values, that values are instrumental in a flourishing life.
Right.
And that's really the only distinction I make. Right? If you call virtues values, well, in a way, you're recognizing that. I think it would usually be that the primary thing is the concrete thing you achieve, which in this case would be life. You could call it a life in the sense, or a value in the sense that it's part of what conceptually you say makes life valuable in a sense, but it's not valuable in this sense. We don't want to think of values as just abstract things that we don't have direct contact with. It's important to think of values as things you achieve in life that you can interact with and have a direct impact on your flourishing, not just some feeling good or some even just intellectual quality, but that it serves your life in a specific direct way.
Right.
So there may have some direct connection to the way you lead your life concretely.
Okay, so it's by the way, remember I was asking about concrete goals versus explorations for interests or curiosity with no specific concrete goal in mind. I was reading about geometry and how there was a period where a mathematician started studying knots. And then I think originally the purpose was for physics. They thought it might be useful for physics to, I don't know, something with atoms, but then they discovered that it's not relevant to atoms. So it's a field in maths, the study of knots, and it lost popularity, but it regained popularity when they found it may have application for classifying DNA, because you classify knots and then you can identify before and after DNA transformations and all that. And so I was just, the reason I bring it up is I was thinking, like maybe there's an example of sometimes you can study something. And I mean, if you don't care about money or anything else, this is when it counts. If you care about money, then I guess you have to throw it all out. But sometimes you study something and you don't know what the practical value is, but it's like if all knowledge is this, like all these interlocked chains,
right?
Then sometimes you just don't know. You explore something with curiosity. There's no concrete goal, but then it does end up having a concrete goal.
I've noticed that with different fields that I'm interested in, just the history of it, like even the history of DNA has to do with the history of information science. That DNA was part of the way we think of genes being passed on, or even DNA functioning is it can function like information theory, like how do you communicate one message to one phone to another through technology?
Right.
And that influenced a lot of development about DNA or research in DNA and also within psychology. And it's maybe not immediately obvious to the people who studied it at first. It would just be like into breaking codes with math. That's really all they were into at first. But
that's what information theory is.
It was
I don't-
based more on what it's based on originally, how
oh,
to solve problems and strictly by changing it to forms with like numbers, but it's expanded into like studying that brought new insights into other related fields, and they kind of grew together. Like computers grew alongside research into DNA. They're not completely independent. That um, the way we think about computers has a huge influence on the way we've thought about many other things, what psychology and biology and even physics, because that affected like quantum physics.
that that explains to me the term bioinformatics. I've seen a lot of
Yes.
now that you know, it's I guess courses change over time. I remember many years ago there was courses at university called telecommunications, and now it's like there's bioinformatics, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you could even have DNA literally store data like on a floppy disk and like, or as a USB in a way, then theoretically you can say that DNA stores data and DNA and, like metaphorically, but
Ah, cool.
that way
Okay.
of thinking helps to advance those fields.
Right.
And it does make sense they're integrated as fields, because you have to think about how is it that this one piece of DNA, how does RNA read DNA? In a way, it's like reading a book, metaphorically speaking, that information is being evaluated and or measured in some sense to reproduce cells or whatnot.
Hmm. And then, so initially the field of information theory was a mathematical field that was in solving quantitative problems. Is that, because I haven't looked it up at all?
Yeah, information theory would be that, like, especially problems involving communication,
Oh,
such as
okay.
how do you send one message to another phone?
Right.
Like, how do you make sure the data stays correct? How do you correct it? How do you check if there's errors? How do you know how much like energy you need to send a message, or technological limitations? But the way they thought about that was the concept information, which developing that concept is what had the influence. That now there was a way to think about like information in a way that goes from point A to point B, rather
Okay.
than just as I say a sentence, you hear it and you understand. How do you quantify that instead?
Yeah.
Put that in terms of numbers. And then they figure, oh, you could probably express this for non-messages, like within DNA or um, within physics. Like, how do you describe quantum physics? That's been influenced by information theory because there's
And,
uncertainty within that measurement.
and this relates to your interest in trying to model. I remember you telling me, and I didn't fully get it, but I can see the connection, but the metaphysical possibility of a plane in like a matrix or something.
Correct.
Ah, cool. Well, okay. So yeah, this does relate to the knots, because from what I
Yeah.
understood in the book is that I didn't understand much of it, but from what I understood, they were trying to develop a way to classify the knots, and that would then let them make identifications in DNA pre and post a certain process, and thus pick up on, let's say, I don't know, make more identifications than they otherwise would, be aware of more factors that are relevant in different processes. And so, but that wasn't known before, obviously, that application.
Right.
But then the question is, let's say you work in a certain field. You could be stuck on a problem and you're like, how do I solve this? How do I solve this? But the answer might be like either awaiting a discovery in a different field, or you may need to go to that field and draw out the implications yourself. And so you don't like, apart from just telling, like, it's no help to tell someone, well, you just need to learn everything possible. Like, that doesn't work, because there's a million things to learn. But how does one, given that all knowledge is interrelated and you can't just arbitrarily delimit yourself to your own field? Well, I don't want to, that's arbitrarily, isn't it? But yeah, you can't just like delimit yourself to your own field and isolate yourself and not think about anything else. But then, given how much else there is to know and the possibilities of connection between different fields, how do you, like, what, you can't study everything, you know? So
Yeah.
how do you even think about that?
the way I've thought about it is that the best thing to do is more bootstrap from what you already kind of know. That I can know sometimes where I might want to look for more answers or more insights based on some connection I already recognize. Like, I know you're right to say that we just can't say, well, just know everything about everything. Well, that's not going to help much. You should do it effectively, I think. You should acknowledge the knowledge you hold already. And I think within objectivism, that's an important insight to have, or from that, that we build on our knowledge, or we have a spiral theory about knowledge such that the more we learn, we can go back to other fields. So I think thinking in those terms is better focus on first, what do you already know?
Right.
What do you have in your context of knowledge? What have you learned so far? And you could think, well, what other fields do I already know? At least to maybe a sentence or two about. Can I spiral it back and connect what I know now to something else? Because
yeah,
I think making those connections are usually when you discover something new, where you're trying to integrate it with another field or relate some principle with another field.
yeah,
And that's when you integrate and find something. In a way, you're trying to find the genus of two fields. Like, say, if I were looking at interested in, say for me, I have some interest in psychology, but also information theory somewhat. I can think about, well, what's something that generalizes between the two of them. I can think of the concept information. And that's, for me at least, where I can go to start exploring different solutions to problems I have, maybe in another field that I could think, well, where does this concept else, where else does this concept apply? And I thought, well, maybe it applies to consciousness. So that's, for me, it's like, oh, maybe that would be interesting, but applied to like a conception of free will rather than determinism, which would be an interesting take. And that leads me to somewhere different than I maybe would have otherwise.
right.
Does that process make much sense?
Yeah, I think that I guess you don't need to learn everything. You can learn, but you do need to learn maybe broad fundamentals of different fields. Maybe that's all.
Yeah.
Like a proper education would have you cover every field, and then in a fundamental way and a very grounded way. And then from there, you could probably make those connections, like what is in common between this and this. And it's not that hard to keep, I imagine, not that hard to keep on top of developments, like, and then get, go sort of by instinct, oh, this might relate to this problem that I'm having.
Right.
What did you mean by bootstrap? I've heard bootstrap before. Is that just like, I know in business, that's something like you start from scratch and you raise with no debt and you just build a business, but I don't really know what.
I usually would mean in the sense that you're starting just from only the resources you have, even
Right.
You're not just using, it's not like you're saying, I'm going to use these ideas from somewhere else and just do it.
Okay.
It's about using your own concepts and knowledge. That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah. Okay.
To attain something that might seem unattainable.
Okay. Right. So it's not collecting more info, but with what you've already got, what's in mind, what concepts you have, seeing if you can rearrange them in some new way to.
Yeah, and then from that, you might say, well, maybe I should investigate this deeper, like this aspect of it deeper.
Right.
And that might give me the solution I need.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I've been reading a lot about Da Vinci, and he did everything. Like, he was similar to Aristotle. He'd like dissect bodies. He'd observe water. He'd try and like manipulate geometrical figures. He read all these books later on in Latin, or he was learning Latin. And he did anticipate a lot of scientific discoveries that would come later as well. I can't remember exactly which ones, but he was trying to, basically he didn't know algebra, but he developed, or he was in the process of developing a system to make infinitesimal calculations using just geometrical figures and their transformations. And it was because of his, like, he would look at everything by analogy. So the Earth, he got this analogy not completely right, but it just gives an example. Like, the water of the Earth was like the blood, the ocean was the heart, the soil was the skin. And but he'd do that with everything. He'd be constantly looking back and forth between the different things he was studying and looking for analogies and comparisons and then he'd go on some other venture, like he went into geometrical figures and transforming nonlinear geometrical figures because he wanted to be able to like capture the movement of water and mathematically. But he was able to do so much because of that integrative, the author called it systems thinking. So it seems like
I like that term. I use
Yeah.
that term sometimes too. Systems thinking I would think of it more as a lot about finding similarities and differences and seeing how things relate together
Yes.
rather than in isolation. Because everything's a system in a way. You can't just treat one fact in isolation. It's going to affect another one in some way.
But it's hard to see. I don't find it like, especially maybe the less connected something is, the harder it is to see the
for sure.
This is from Opa as well. I'm just reviewing a couple of things. So it says, for a philosophical idea to function properly as a guide, the full system to which it belongs must be known and validated. Do you agree with that? Like, I don't know if I've got the right, I'm thinking about the thing that Leonard or Peikoff is thinking of, but I was thinking of like, well, is it an idea if Nietzsche tells you, well, maybe it's not a philosophical idea, but I was thinking of like, when he says, in order to differentiate what is in man's nature and what is just the mood of man, like, how do you differentiate that? You need to study history. That's an idea, but you don't need a full system to make sense of it, right? You don't need to know a full system to validate that idea. So isn't that the same across all philosophy? They have all kinds of ideas that are valuable on their own.
It could be that way, but I think I have a problem with this book for a different reason. Because in a way, I'm wondering, well, how do you know what the full system even is? Or like, how would you know, for instance? So you have one idea. Let's say if it was, well, what if it was an idea you came up with, but you don't know yet that there's a full system for it? You only know part of the system, say, let's say you're Ayn Rand when she was in her 30s.
Yeah.
Does that mean her ideas don't function properly because she doesn't have the full system yet? Not even like somewhat full. It's not like, it doesn't say complete, but just full. If it's full, you at least have the structure of it, know what the basic principles are, I think. But what if you don't know those yet? Would that be to say that your philosophical ideas can't function because you didn't create the system yet or function properly? I wonder about that. But I do think on another level, he might be right in the sense that we can't say if the idea is functioning in the way it ought to if you've not integrated with other philosophical principles. I'm not sure about needing the full system or what precisely he means by full.
Yeah, it's
unclear. But I think you would need a large portion of a system to be able to use it properly. Because let's say Rand did have some incomplete ideas. It would not guide her in some other ways because there's something she's not yet integrated with, or there's some information she knows she left out.
Right.
So it's like haven't yet validated your ideas. So they can only do so much if you yet to validate them within a large system, which could be a reason that it could take most of your life to develop a system, because to have that full understanding, it might take decades to do.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that, it depends what he means by properly and a full system, because every time I think when someone says like fully integrated, well, there's integration is never ending, right? So it's that. And then the extreme example, I also think of the extreme example he gave of like, if you don't integrate honesty with the other virtues, and honesty means to you the refusal of the unreal or something like that, then, well, anytime someone invents something, they're being dishonest. Or if you're hungry, you should take food because otherwise you're not corresponding to reality. That's an extreme example, but That the point is like there needs to be some level of integration to other ideas for a philosophical idea to function. But yeah, I don't know. It's like you gave the example of, it's not that clear.
Yeah, I would think an obvious example, maybe what he means to say, somebody heard just, you ought to live life for your own sake. Somebody just heard that, didn't know anything else about Ayn Rand or anything else about the system that she created. It would be like, can that idea function? It isn't integrated, it isn't connected to other ideas. It's almost held in isolation. So it can't achieve its function supposed to.
Right.
Having that principle in mind, it's useless at that point.
Yes.
It doesn't do anything yet.
Right. So there's some critical, I don't know where to draw the line, but there's some critical level or critical amount of knowledge and context you need for an idea to function. That's the point. But we don't know if it's a full system or how much, we can't quantify it, but we just know there needs to be some kind of context.
Yeah, there needs to be something systematic.
Yes. So the other thing was politics studies the nature. It was written as studies the nature of a social system and not, and then defines proper functions of government. I changed it to studies the nature of social systems, not a social system. And then I thought, okay, that makes more sense, because what does it mean to study the nature of a social system? But then all these questions started coming up, like, well, does that mean if it studies the nature of social systems, politics should be studying history? Because how else do you study and define the proper, how else do you study social systems and define the proper functions of government without reference to ones that have already been set up? So I don't know if you've got thoughts on, would you make any distinction between that studies a social system versus the nature of social systems?
I don't think it makes much of a difference with whether it's plural or not.
Yeah, okay.
I'm thinking, could there be a difference if it's just singular?
But isn't a social system basically a government? That's like people under a government is a social system, right?
Yes, it is.
People living together with some level of cooperation is a social system. So I just thought, oh, okay, well, politics, you would be studying, if you want to be based on reality, you would be studying lots of other social systems in history.
Yeah, I agree with that, at least in the way that epistemology can relate to psychology. It's not like you need to be a psychologist to do epistemology, but it feeds into that quite easily, that it can help inform or add to what you have with epistemology, but it doesn't determine your beliefs. See, when you study history, I think you're right that history is critical to integrating some information, integrating some ideas in concrete. I think that's a given, but we can say that politics is just the broader consideration of that, of history. We're trying to go more broad than history per se, within objectives, and that's usually the history of political ideas or political philosophy. That is where we're just going broader than history to like define the way history progresses, what's essential to history, what's essential to historical events. And that can help define what is history, what is proper historical analysis, what are proper historical questions.
Well, aren't we now defining history though? So wait, I'm confused. So politics, the field of politics itself is philosophical, right? But then there's a historical aspect.
I guess there is some of it. Like, what I'm trying to say is that politics does have some study of history, but I don't think all of history is relevant to that. I mean, history could also apply to ethics, even history can apply to everything, because it's just, they show human action. But as far as politics, you can also use history. History is more like your empirical information, the observations of the world, but philosophy needs to integrate
Yeah.
them more widely than that.
Okay. So politics is thinking about social systems, defining proper functions of governments, but by reference to the concretes which come from history. That's what it is. And then obviously some kind of philosophical, like the base philosophical view on, metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and all that. Yeah.
I mean, like for as far as concretes, you can't even just do what you see in your day-to-day life, because if you only see like of your family and then your town is not really much of a wide social system, how they operate in a natural scale, and what those can mean on a wider scale. Like even looking at Galt's Gulch and in Atlas Shrugged, even Rand said that's not like an ideal vision of the government. That's just a private property where you can really do whatever the property owner defines what they want.
Yeah.
It doesn't at all resemble a political system.
Right.
The system needs something even wider than that. You need, say, entire countries, entire historical context of hundreds and thousands of people. Then those are the more proper concretes.
Yeah. And would you say politics has both a descriptive and a normative or a evaluative aspect? Like, so the descriptive is the study of the social systems, like what are they, which ones have been tried, and then the normative is the definition of proper functions of government.
Yeah, like what's working well, which ones are bad, which ones are good, which ones fail, which ones succeed.
Yeah, and what? Yeah, okay. Okay. Machines and minds. So to me, I was just trying to make an analogy between humans and everything in my house and machines. And so I was thinking about, so mind is different simply because I think machines to me would be anything. One of the characteristics of a machine is that it's non-conscious. But would you say the essential of a machine is that it performs some function with an energy source? Or because I mean that would include humans too. It's maybe a non-conscious thing that performs some function with an energy source. What do you think of that?
Non-conscious that uses an energy source?
Yeah, that's the best I can come up with right now on the spot.
Machine.
Because I was thinking everything in my house is, in a sense, like all my electronics are machines. The stove is a machine. The microwave is a machine. I'm just trying to get my head around like everything that's a machine in my house.
I'm trying to think it'd be better to define it in terms of lacking free will, I think, because that's more the essential distinction than what, I mean, sure, it's conscious or not, but I think you could even use free will to get deeper than that. You can get the nature of the way it chooses these things, namely that it's more determined, more predetermined, that in the way that you say turn a crank, one cog moves the other cog, and that is not any self-direction. It's just mechanically directed, or it's only mechanical causation. It has no internal causation. Is that's the best? It is a difficult thing to define because you need to find the line between what makes them human versus not. Usually the easiest answer would be, say, acting entities that lack free will.
Although that would include birds.
I disagree.
Wouldn't it?
I mean, I would say they're still conscious. Animals would still be conscious, whether or not they're.
I thought you said free will. Like conscious, I agree with, but if it's just free will, then I thought, okay,
well,
then
I think they do have free will too. But just to simplify it, let's just say machines are self-directed things that lack consciousness, because they are self-directed in the sense that once they start going, they don't need anyone else to control them. Like if you turn on a lawnmower, it's just going to spin its blade no matter what.
Okay,
but it's not conscious in any sense.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I was curious. I don't know if I'm going to make any more analogies with that, but I was curious because that's what Da Vinci did. He was like, when he dissect bodies, he started studying mechanics because he made analogies between, like levers and gears and the way our bodies function. And so he started looking at it that way. Anyway, next random question.
Or I should say that Descartes used to think that animals were the equivalent of machines.
I remember, yeah, that's where the discussion in that book on Da Vinci came up. It was like, he didn't call him, and I think Descartes came after Da Vinci, but the author who was writing about Da Vinci railing against the abbreviators, as he called them, and then he went on to, Descartes was an example of someone reducing everything to its component parts.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, I've even seen diagrams in one history of philosophy book that I have with Descartes. I think he drew like animals as these gears and machines.
Yes.
So, yeah. Okay.
So that's why, I mean, consciousness is essential to the distinction between animate versus inanimate.
Right.
I mean, it's a blurry line because then you start to wonder, well, when exactly do you say an acting entity is conscious? Because they're still self-directed. Machines can direct themselves once they start going. So at one point do you say it's conscious?
Right.
Or could you ever say it's conscious?
Right.
And that's a huge debate, of course.
Yeah, that it is an interesting conversation. Let's see what I'm just trying to get my head around some of the virtues in more detail. And so I was thinking, okay, let's say in the middle of work, I haven't said I'm going to take a break. This is just randomly in the middle of work. I'm like, oh, let me check my phone, or let me hop on YouTube. And then I was like, okay, what's the operating principle here? Is it habit, compulsion? Is it an instance of emotionalism? And I was like, no, maybe that's a compromise of, so the principle is integrity. That is being, or the principle is the compromise of integrity, not acting in accordance with values. But things like habit is a concept, compulsion is a concept, emotionalism, I don't know if that's a principle or a generalization. I'm just trying to get my head around like, what is an operating principle? And using a silly example with checking a phone, something marginal, like what are the operating principles? The only thing I could come up with, the operating principle in the moment where I check my phone when I said I'd work, is that whatever the opposite of integrity is, a compromise on integrity, a violation of values, if you want to go more broader. So maybe something like checking phone, operating principle is violating the principle of integrity. This is really simplified, but it's just to get my head around it, which is violating virtues, something like that, right? Those are the operating principles. What would you say? Do you agree?
So far, it's fine.
Yeah, okay.
I would add more to it, but
what else would you add?
Well, checking phone, then I think in between the violation and checking phone, or somewhere before the violation is your motivation. Like, I think you need context of the motivation to check the phone first. Like, why did you decide to do that? Or what justification do you come up with?
Is when we say there's a mode, like an operating, okay, so is that an operating concept or an operating principle or an operating generalization to say there's motivation involved? There's psychological, maybe it's, well, motivation is a psychological principle, right?
Right, yeah.
So you would say it is the operating principle, which is a psychological one, is motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Because that's something that sets context, and knowing your motivation can help set the context.
Okay.
Like, presumably you have the motivation first, then you check the phone.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
Presumably.
Yeah.
Sometimes people might just, you check the phone by habit, then you come up with the motivation after the fact. Well, that would be dishonesty if that happened.
Well, let's look at that one. Let's say we're saying it's habit. Is habit considered a principle, an operating principle, or
I
is
wouldn't
it
call it a principle, really.
Yeah, that's what I was. Okay, so what would habit
It's
be?
not something you decide to use. I don't know. It would be
A generalized concept, or a operating concept, or a generalization?
it's what you're acting on.
Oh,
I'm not sure what word I'd use. I mean, I would just call it a behavior. I wouldn't even like to say it's a principle.
yeah,
It's just a behavior that happens. Motivation, I'd say, is a principle because you can say it involves so much of the way you even function in the first place.
right.
But habits really specific. So,
Okay. Well, I got another low level example to look at just to get my head around this idea. So let's say you're hungry, you feel hunger, like you feel it in your stomach. So is hunger an operative generalization? Like, I'm just trying to get to the point where I can list off like the concepts that are applicable in any given situation. And so would you say hunger is an operative generalization, or is it simply because hunger is a concept, right? So it's not a generalization. And then I was
I would
thinking
call it
maybe,
a cause more
okay,
so. A habit I might also consider a cause because
okay,
habit causes that. Well, motivation too, but I say it's a principle too because it captures so much of the essential nature of way humans act. But
sorry,
habit
which one are you speaking about? Habit and motivation?
motivation
Oh, okay.
is so essential to human action that I call it a principle. But
Okay.
habit, we call it cause. Hunger could be a type of cause as well. You maybe thought of it as a proximal causes, they might say, because it's immediate.
Okay.
Like you get your hunger, then you eat because that's
Yes.
sufficient enough to get you to eat. So you could just call it a cause.
Okay.
But then
So,
you could talk about the nature of that cause.
so I might be overcomplicating it by trying to identify some
Right.
operating principle.
Right. I think that's overcomplicating it.
Yeah.
We could
Yeah.
call it like there's a cause and an action, and then a consequence in a way, and a further consequence. That's the way you've described this actually, in a way.
Hmm.
To generalize what you wrote, like you have a motivation, that's the cause.
Yeah.
You have an action, checking the phone. Then there's a consequence of that action, which is violating integrity.
Right.
And then even further down the line, violating virtues as a whole.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess you could look at it from, I don't know, from different perspectives. So like one is obviously the principle of cause and effect is
Yep.
operative or applicable, but it's not that helpful to think on such an abstract level about it. But
Yep.
cause and effect, which includes consequence, but then there'll be motivation is the specific concrete. I mean,
Yeah.
I've got another here. So operative versus applicable principles or generalizations. So operative is like, so what's relevant now? I don't know if this distinction is helpful, but you can tell me what you think. So operative is what you can say about the current situation. So, you know, like one principle that is operative right now, if you feel hungry and you eat, it's cause and effect, just to be really simple. And then applicable is like, if you look at any given situation, a concrete situation, if you want to try also identify an applicable principle that's, you know, something that applies to this situation, but is not currently present in this concrete situation. So like the hungry, and then you might say an applicable generalization is fasting has good long-term health benefits, and whatever principles that relies on, I don't know. But what do you think of that distinction?
I wouldn't use it in that way.
Okay.
I see what you're trying to distinguish. You're trying to distinguish the more immediate from the more broader, which we could say there's a difference the way Aristotle conceives of action, the four consequent or the four causes. So the first one, the operative, that's more what Aristotle would think of as like mechanical causation, just what's more immediate, what's more just immediately in front of you.
Right.
Like you sat down because you bent your knees and sat on the chair.
Right.
You can call that just it's immediate, but then you could have something where like efficient cause, the cause was the cause of you sitting was needing to rest, for example.
Yeah.
Or you could have another cause, maybe final, like there's like efficient cause, final cause, formal cause. I think formal cause would be like you wanted to rest, but while you were resting, you wanted to study philosophy. I mean, you could think of the causes differently.
Okay.
And I think thinking in those terms might be better. Just in what way do we distinguish the causes, or do we distinguish the actions? Rather than say, are they operative? Are they applicable? I think those are confusing terms.
Yeah, okay. I was also trying to get at differentiating maybe descriptive and normative. So like when you're doing something, you're like, here are the principles that explain this specific thing. And then you could also, in another frame of thinking, you could say, well, what else, what other principles are relevant that can be applied to this situation? That's sort of what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
With principles, it seems like from what I've understood so far is if one studies philosophy, then the process of, let's say, living by certain principles, like all of these, right? That's a lot of stuff. There's a lot in each of them. They've both got so many. And in every situation, in every action decision you take, like down to the minutest, smallest one, not that you'd need to do this because you'd literally freeze. You wouldn't be able to do anything. But it's like you got to run through a gamut of slow, single thoughts to identify the appropriate steps or action. For example, you're walking down the street, just to take a really mundane example that I don't know if you'd apply to this example, but you could like, all right, should I turn my eyes left or right? You could then walk through in your head rationalism, integrity, independence, honesty, justice, and filter your decision through all of those. I mean, this applies to every decision you make, but you would obviously just apply it to those that make sense, that are bigger. But that seems to be the process, right? Like, and then over years, as you run through each single one for every decision you make, you habituate it. That's my understanding of the process of adopting principles.
Kind of. I don't want to say it's all linear. I mean, development has to be gradual and sometimes because you can't develop a skill unless you use it repeatedly. But on the other hand, there's still other ways to transform. Say, I think there's room for acknowledging the uncertainties and exploring the answers to those. Say, you say, what if I spoke to that person sitting at that table and you don't usually talk to people? I mean, there could be, it's not necessarily dangerous or irrational if you didn't have much of a reason. If you just said, well, I really have no idea what will happen because of all these definitely unpredictable things that I don't know the context for. Like I don't know anything about their values or anything. So in effect, you don't know. You can't even predict what they'll say or do or think. And you can, I think, sometimes use those situations like that to discover something new in not such a slow way. Because if you do that, you have to involve a lot of thinking about many things to see what values do they hold, what values do I hold, what do I want to talk about, how should I talk about it? Like it puts you in the spotlight, so to speak, and you could explore more connections that way without being so slow and linear, and also without having the even ability to think of the answer beforehand, because there is uncertainty, and there's nothing wrong with seeking knowledge in uncertainty. If anything, I think that'd be an interesting way to develop your character, like challenge yourself, become more involved in the uncertainty, and actually find ways to discover how to adapt or grow or apply those principles to attain some
I agree
new
with
values,
that.
for instance.
I agree, although I didn't get the connection between, maybe I didn't explain it well, but okay, so even in the situation you give where, like, let's say there's someone sitting on a different table and you're like, oh, maybe I should go speak to them. Like I'm just saying that in a way, those kind of thoughts you have and the decisions you make are often a result of habit. But if you wanted to integrate, let's say, philosophical principles, and I'm not speaking specifically of objectivism here, but I mean, it's just an example because I've been studying it and I've listed all these principles. Yeah. You're sitting down and you could, let's say you pause time, which you can't do, but just for this example, we pause time. And if you wanted to change your character down to the core, yes, you need to take action, but you would take it by filtering it through principles. So you'd be like, okay, what would be the reason to speak to this person? Well, I want to meet someone new and it could potentially be fun and interesting. And then what would be a reason not to? I'm afraid. Okay, well, that's basing a decision off emotional, just an emotion that has no basis in reality. It does have a basis. Let's just go, it's basing your decision off an emotion. Do I want to act off emotions? Because there's not that much that can go wrong here that I can think of. Or do I want to act on rational thought? Do I want to be someone who, like, if we're then going on to integrity, if I say I value adventure and learning new things, do I want to act with integrity or not? Do I want to be independent? I don't know. You get what I'm saying, right? Like you could run through a list of principles and then validate the decision and then go do it, right? Whatever it is. But the process of transforming yourself is the one of making those decisions by reference to principles. I gave a stupid example of like, should you turn your eye here or there? Like you could still apply principles to that situation. But what I'm saying is, I guess, because we do definitely accumulate all these habits and most of them are subconscious and maybe they're subconsciously principled, but then to transform, it would be painful because there's no way to hold, like, let's say there's 6 principles here that you want to integrate. You can't hold them all in your mind and just go, oh, let me just act according to these. You have to manually run through one at a time because you can only hold so much. So is that clearer? Because
I think so.
The example you gave was, I agree with it, but I didn't see, at least to what I was attempting to explain, I didn't see the connection.
Yeah. I would agree then that, yes, it will be long and slow, but I think the more you do it, the easier it becomes in a way that it's slowest at the start because you take more work to realize which is which and how to integrate them and how to use them quickly. I think maybe after a few years and it's like, oh, within moments you could do it.
Right.
I think it really depends on to what extent you've been using them already and to what extent they're new.
I guess I was also trying to make a distinction between, I like the way he puts it, synoptic, a flash of synoptic insight. Like you read a philosophy and then you can just suddenly take actions in accordance with that philosophy, which I don't think can happen. Or you read a whole philosophy and then you've basically, let's say, memorized certain key points. And then now you painfully feed through decisions and thought processes through those memorized verse one, maybe we'll call it one by one, slow. I used linear, it was just a synonym. I wasn't really thinking through in detail. One by one, slow process of something. I don't know. I can't think of anything now. So, I mean, I think that was the distinction I was trying to get at. Whatever philosophy you read, there's no like, I read it, I'm a philosophy professor, I've now transformed. It's more like you have to take a lot of actions and you have to do things like you pointed out, go into the unknown and then apply the system into the unknown. But applying the system is not like you apply it in one go. It's more like you sit through and it's painful when you have to think through a lot of different concepts that you've maybe memorized, something like that. But is that distinction? I mean, I use the metaphor analogy of running through a gamut. So there's all these thoughts that you've memorized on the sidelines, like either cheering you on or hitting you or something like that.
I can almost think of it like a spider web, where when you start out, there's some different strands that are probably weak and unconnected to the rest, and that it seems like they're unconnected. And it's not a strong web, it's just going to fall apart quickly.
Yes.
But once it's all spun together, there's connections between them and among them and new ones.
Right.
and that strengthens it all. And it's easier to cross the web once it's all together than when it's in pieces. That once it's all integrated, then it's like you can jump from one end to the other really quick. Or as it gets stronger, it gets easier to move from one end to the other.
Yeah. Do you think that, would you agree with me that you can, like, I could read all these books on philosophy and explain them quite well, but I still might not be that different as a person, because the process of, let's say, applying the philosophy that you study, like explaining it is one thing, but then applying it is another, because it has to be done on a, in a, I don't, yeah, on that one by one, in that one by one way. Like, what, I can't think of good words to put it, but has to be done, like, broken down into little components, and each has to be focused on individually. Like, you integrate it obviously, but the process of, let's say, integrating into your character, which is, I would say, is that's on the level of the subconscious, would become every little individual component is addressed individually for any given situation at until the point where they do start becoming spun together, like you explained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Nietzsche says something about this.
Oh.
I'll show you maybe next time we talk about Nietzsche, because I don't want to have interference in your memories with these at the moment. So, but yeah, I have a good essay on Nietzsche that puts in interesting characteristic or interesting phrasing to these things.
The spiderweb analogy is from Nietzsche too, by the way, the conceptual spiderweb. Yeah. Remember we read on Truth and Lies, and he talks about spinning the web, strong web. So it gets, it's got to be strong enough so that it doesn't get blown by the winds, but it's got to be subtle or soft enough for a flood to run it over.
Yeah, I don't think I meant to do that, but you're right. That is from Nietzsche.
Yeah,
I wasn't thinking him at the time, but
that's cool.
Right.
It's nice that you can get that example. And I liked also, he talked about this hexagonal, like beehive like tower of concepts. Or he used the Roman Calambrium, I think, as an analogy. And then that can, I think he said it can collapse, I'm not sure. But then Thomas Kuhn also talks about, like, the revolution in concepts, where we work within this hive of concepts.
Yes.
It's got a similar analogy.
And in a way, that's what Nietzsche's point is about concepts and metaphors, that we seem to have all these common metaphors for different ways of thinking, that it's really just metaphors and not reference to reality, or at least that's Nietzsche's understanding of it. There's a lot of metaphor in our own day-to-day language.
One thing I'm still I'm not that clear on, but you know, how we're saying all knowledge is interrelated because the whole universe is causally interrelated. Like, so when you come up with a metaphor for some subject, you're making some kind of connection, but it's not a, is that related to the principle or not really? Because metaphors, like analogies break down, metaphors break down, right? They're not, they're I don't know if you want to say model, but so how does that relate to the principle of all knowledge being interrelated? Like the hierarchical structure of knowledge. A metaphor is just pointing out a similarity, but is it relevant to that principle or not?
Probably not, because it's almost just like imagination.
Yeah.
You can make whatever kind of connection fancies you.
Yeah.
It's more like arbitrary connections that are maybe aesthetically pleasing, but not themselves any requirement to be that way.
Right. Maybe we can fit in one more. No, we're not gonna, this is too long. So, I did.
Like Picas's idea of like the encirclist. Like you could make a metaphor that way, but it's completely bad.
Good example.
Bad cognition.
Right.
Bad use of integration.
Right.
And with the metaphor, you're doing it, but there's some failure to integrate. It's deliberate, but it's to illustrate a point, not to demonstrate a real objective connection.
Yeah, I guess you could point out that So on one level, yes, metaphors are just there to highlight certain kinds of similarities, but they're not necessarily essential, and differences. But then maybe the connection to the principle of all knowledge is interrelated is the fact that you can see circles and things. Like, what is it? Cigarettes? Like cigarettes do have a circular shape. There is such a thing as a circle, and then that knowledge is connected to other. I don't know. I need to think about it more. But have you read any Hannah Arendt?
No.
She wrote a book called The Banality of Evil.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'll skip it then.